Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTube at War. This is a new BookTube event created by a viewer, created by DDB, and turned into a BookTube event by Michael K. Vaughan. And as you can tell from the title, it's all about military fiction, military nonfiction, military memoirs, all sorts of things like that. I love this sort of stuff, so I've been giving myself over wholeheartedly to BookTube at War and wanting to read more than I do. But I've been leaving it up to an element of chance each night as I pick my reading. And I spun the wheel last night and sort of landed on a book and was all ready to read it. And then just by chance, I dipped in to a different book. I'm sure you've had this happen to you. I dipped into a different book, and it pulled me in as if I'd never read it before. It pulled me in effortlessly, and I reread the whole thing. I reread a book that once upon a time would have needed no introduction on any public forum. Now, unfortunately, it probably does. But I reread The Caine Mutiny by Herman Wouk. This was not the book that I picked. But I found this old hardcover, I think, earlier this year, and I thought I'll dip in, I'll read a bit, just maybe a favorite scene or two. This book came out in 1951. I've already read it. I read it a long, long time ago. And then about 30 years ago, I forget the publisher, but a publisher came out with a lovely trade paperback, a new trade paperback, and I reread it then. And I've read bits and pieces of it in chunks in between those two times. I thought I was kind of a long way off from a long reread, but a long front-to-back reread, a detailed reread, what better time for that than BookTube at War? So I reread this last night and loved it, absolutely loved it. Herman Wouk, he's famous for this book. He's famous for maybe a couple of other things. He wrote an enormous book called Young Blood Hawk that I think owes a little too much to Thomas Wolfe, and goes on a little bit long, and he wrote The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which are really, really good books, although they also go on. They are definitely the products of not only narrative genius, but Wolffian excess, whereas there's no excess here. That's one of the things that struck me about this book. It's not a short book. It's like 500 pages long. Is that right? Yeah, it's 460 pages long. But there's no excess on it at all. It reads like a shot. One of the things I noticed about this during last night's reread was how much dialogue there is here, how much of the book is carried by dialogue with only the thinnest scaffolding of text at parts. There are long parts that are text, but there are long parts that aren't. It makes me understand all the more why this adapted so well to the screen. This, of course, became a famous movie starring Humphrey Bogart. And that's why I say that once upon a time it would have needed very little introduction, because this book was a huge, huge success, even before the movie. The movie just made it more of a success. It's a World War II novel, one of the great World War II novels, and it's set mostly aboard the sort of rundown, seen better days Pacific Fleet destroyer, the USS Caine. Which is involved in, it's not your typical frontline ship, although it does aid in invasions of one island or island chain after another in the Pacific campaign, but it's mainly doing other things. It's mainly doing the more go-between stuff of the bigger, more sleek and state-of-the-art destroyers and warships. And it has a bad captain when the book commences. And the crew doesn't like the captain doesn't like the crew, but the captain is kind of distracted. He's bored. He's bad, but he's bored. He gets replaced early on by a captain named Philip Queeg, who at the very first, doesn't seem bad. He lets his crew know that he is not a disciplinarian, but definitely discipline-oriented. He's by the book. So you had a bad commander, and this ship was allowed to run a little bit to heal. We're going to fix that, but I'm not going to be unfair. I want everything to be absolutely superb. I want this to be a ship to be proud of, but I'm not going to be, a martinet. And there's a little bit of resentment on the part of the crew anyway. Obviously, you would imagine that, right? Is that if your ship had been allowed to run a little to heel and things had been allowed to get a little bit easy, you might like it that way. You might like to keep it that way. Even if you're just doing exercises at Pearl Harbor, you might still like to keep it that way. We have a core cast of officers. There's Willie Keith, who is really the kind of narrative focus of this book. He is he's a fair-haired boy, comes from money, goes to Princeton, and he has a lovely fiancée, and comes to the Navy as an outsider. He's not the only outsider, but he's the one that will help us to see things afresh. And he's also the one who will inject wonder and awe into the scenes where Wouk knows that he needs it. Boy, oh boy, when you're reading this novel, I realized more than ever that there is just nothing about storytelling that Herman Wouk does not know. Just nothing. I was reminded, I know this will be heresy to literary snobs out there, but I was reminded the whole time I was reading this of Louis L'Amour. If you read 4 or 5 Louis L'Amour novels in a row, of course, if you write as many novels as Louis L'Amour, anybody will write a few bad ones. But if you read a few good Louis L'Amour novels in a row, you will, whether you like them or not, you will realize, okay, well, whether this is my cup of tea or not, there's nothing about storytelling that this guy doesn't know. And the same thing is true with Herman Wouk. He went the respectable route instead of writing pulp westerns. But you at first wonder why Willie Keith is in this book, and certainly why he's given so much prominence. And then you realize, no, this scene, that scene, the next scene, they won't work as well if you aren't filtering some of it through his perceptions. But there are more jaded characters. There's Lieutenant Merrick, and there's also Lieutenant Kiefer, who is the most fascinating character in the book, I think. I think you're supposed to think that Queeg himself is, but I think Kiefer is the most fascinating character, especially as it reflects on Herman Wouk, since Kiefer is a writer. But it's Lieutenant Merrick that the story centers around, because the more the crew dislikes Captain Queeg, the more obvious they make that. They're never outwardly insubordinate. But Queeg starts to know that he doesn't have his men. And he's not a strong man. He's been a frontline commander. We get the strong impression that has eaten away at him a little psychologically. But we also get the impression that he wasn't all that strong to begin with. He's competent. He's never received anything like a reprimand from any superior. He's carried out every performance that he's had to do very well. He's a competent line officer. But he's insecure. And one of the questions that I really found myself thinking about in this read-through was, what would have happened if his officers and crew had shored him up instead of tearing him down? It's a point that comes out later in the book. What would have happened if he knew that he had their confidence? Would he have maybe been a better commander? I think the narrative at a couple of points, there's a very dramatic kamikaze attack. There's a very dramatic sequence where the ship encounters a typhoon, which, snug at home inland in America in the 21st century, you might not think much of that. But a typhoon on the open ocean can take a gigantic multi-tonnage warship and toss it around like a child's toy. They're nothing to kid around about. They can, if you don't take them seriously, if you don't give them the respect they deserve, you can go into one with half a fleet of aircraft carriers and come out with none. Admiral Halsey learned that the hard way, and plenty of other commanders did too in the Pacific. You can't take them lightly. Wouk doesn't take them lightly. He never describes it as just a bad bout of weather. It could easily cause the Caine's destruction. And during that sequence, it's tough to make the case, no matter how much Wouk has played on your sympathies, which in an odd way he does with Captain Queeg. It's tough to read that sequence and think that Queeg wouldn't have been the death of everyone on board if he hadn't been countermanded. And of course, that's the incident at the heart of this book, is that at the height of that typhoon, when Lieutenant Merrick thinks that if we keep following the captain's orders, we're all going to die, at that moment, Merrick takes command. in the wheelhouse. He just tells Captain Queeg, you are no longer giving orders. I am taking your ship. I'll ordering the officers to come in here and note the time and the date in the log. I know that I will answer for my actions, but you are no longer in command. I need to right this vessel or we're all going to die. At that moment, Marek tells Queeg, you're not a healthy man. Which, idiosyncrasies to the side, we have not seen that. You get the strong impression that that's Marek laying his own defense ahead of time, because that is the only way in the Navy rulebook that you can relieve your captain, is if he's not in his right mind. And the rulebook is Queeg's Bible. He tells his crew when he gets on board, he tells them that he believes every regulation is in there for a reason. And in the same paragraph, in the same speech, where he says that he's a by-the-book commander, and he believes that every regulation is in there for the book, for the right reason, that it's all a very sound code. In that same slightly self-aggrandizing speech, he also tells them there are 4 ways to do things on a ship: the right way, the wrong way, the Navy way, and my way. And on my ship, things will be done my way. Which, is one of the many examples in the long monologues that Wouk damningly gives to Captain Queeg. He lets Captain Queeg talk, and that's all you need to form your impression of this man. It's one of the many times in those monologues where Queeg just flatly contradicts himself. But they survive. Thanks to Lieutenant Marek, they survive. They survive the typhoon, and eventually this is going to come down to a courtroom scene, a court-martial. Because Lieutenant Marek is court-martialed for mutiny. Oh, it's just no small thing. He's not court-martialed for slapping someone or for insubordination. He's court-martialed for mutiny. And again, it's perfect illustration of Wouk's storytelling ability, because the whole huge final chunk of this book is not only a courtroom scene, which is fascinating on its own if you do it well, but also almost entirely dialogue. It's just amazing to see. If you've ever tried writing yourself, you'll know you have to be pretty confident in your abilities. Herman Wouk was 40 when he wrote this book, and hadn't had a real breakout hit before this. And this was widely acknowledged to be one of the great, if not the first great, novels to come out of the war. And it was a huge success. Just everybody read it. Everybody wanted to talk about it. It was one of those things you need for a bestseller, which is that it didn't just appeal to interested parties, to vets. Everyone was talking about it. The Church Ladies Social Club would have a book club around this book, even though it gets pretty salty. A lot saltier than you will know if you're only familiar with this from the Humphrey Bogart movie. Bogart does a great job in that movie as Captain Queeg, in the sense of being both oily and slightly sordid, but in a way with a kind of damaged, cracked charisma. In the way of those of you, for instance, who've ever had bad managers, or maybe if you're in the military, you've had a bad commander like this, where there's no way to like them, but part of their damaged, cracked charisma kind of makes you want to. You see them and you wish they were better. You wish they were more worthy of your loyalty. They aren't, but you kind of wish they were, which is, keep in mind, not the rule. The Caine's first commander was not like that. No one felt that about him. No one felt the conflict to want to like him. Marek is tortured. He's tormented by this. He's not vindicated. Willie Keith is vindicated in that moment because he just doesn't like being bossed around by a weirdo like Captain Queeg. But Marek is not glorying in this at all. He's tortured by the fact that he had to take command from his captain, that he had to commit mutiny in order to save the crew. And the whole huge final chunk of this book is that courtroom scene, which if you don't know the movie, or if you've only seen one part of the movie, maybe excerpted in a reel or something like that, you will have seen the courtroom discombobulation of Captain Queeg, where Humphrey Bogart his Queeg just falls apart. If you haven't seen that movie, if you haven't seen that scene, you have certainly seen the much more recent homage to that scene, to that moment, in the Tom Cruise movie, A Few Good Men, where Jack Nicholson does that moment. He does Captain Queeg. He puts his own Jack Nicholson spin on it, but it's the exact same scene. It's the scene of someone falling apart and incriminating himself on the stand while thinking that he's got everything under control. It fits perfectly with the way, the innumerable canny ways that Wouk has described Captain Queeg throughout the book. We get introduced to Captain Queeg, and ironically enough, when he enters court for this court-martial, for Marik's court-martial, we're told that he looks the very model of a spit and polish Navy officer. You would never guess that there was anything wrong with him. There was anything substandard about him. But during the rest of the book, at every chance, Wouk characterizes him with language. So he doesn't ever call him names, but he won't say that he walks somewhere. He'll say that he scurries somewhere. He won't say that he sticks his head around a corner, but that he jerks his head around a corner, or he pokes his head furtively around a corner. He doesn't actually just outright tell you to dislike Queeg, but there's no chance by the time you get to the court-martial that you will like Queeg. There's no chance that that will be true. And then the court-martial happens, and Queeg's Judge Advocate General, Queeg's lawyer, is outraged by the way the other side is going about the trial. They're not attacking Marik at all. They're not even trying the case of whether or not Marik committed mutiny and was justified in doing so. Instead, it's just a concerted attack on Queeg. This command decision, that command decision, the other command decision. And just at every moment in that courtroom scene, when you think, okay, well, now you're being unfair. What difference does it make if he brought alcohol on board during wartime? Is that really that big of an infraction? Queeg himself says, rank has its privileges. That's what I thought. I think I'm justified. I think all of the serving naval officers, keep in mind, these aren't judges. These are serving naval officers who are judging him. I think all of you would have done the same. Just when you read something like that and you think, yeah, he's probably right. Well, I mean, what is all of this? Shouldn't you be concentrating on Marik, not Queeg? Just when that happens, Wouk will then let Queeg go on. He'll let Queeg talk. Especially, there are some things in the trial scene in the book that don't occur in the movie. Like, for instance, Queeg's protracted insinuation that Lieutenant Kiefer, the writer, who has been orchestrating all of this behind the scenes, he's been moving people, poisoning their attitude towards Queeg, working them up, getting them ready to think this guy is going to kill us all, that he's insupportable. At one point, when you're tempted to think that's all one way, then Queeg on the stand goes on at length in an oily, horrifying way about how, Kiefer had a sweet spot for this other officer, and it was like they were married, etc., etc. I mean, even the court bridles at that. You're making an insinuation that, keep in mind, at the time, was the most serious insinuation that you could make short of mutiny. It's unbelievable that you would even insinuate that, and Queeg realizes that and backs off immediately. So I wasn't insinuating anything. Just when you want to feel sympathy for this guy, he torpedoes it, always, himself. Beautifully, beautifully done. And Wouk carries that character insight all the way home with Lieutenant Kiefer. We get him in civilian dress, we get him in civilian situations, and we don't like him. We don't like him. At first, you are set up to think that this book is a trio of heroes against a villain. Willie Keith, Lieutenant Marik, and Kiefer against Queeg. But as the book goes on, it becomes infinitely more complex. Queeg is not. He's weak and insinuating and self-justifying. He's perfectly willing to lie about an officer's behavior if he thinks there's no record to prove him otherwise, in order to make himself look good or to justify himself. But he's not an outright monster. I would argue that De Vries, the first captain of the Caine, was more of a monster than Queeg, but it quickly becomes complicated in exactly that way. It's not just Queeg. Willie Keith, we don't like him. By the end of the book, you don't like any of these characters, none of them at all, except maybe the hapless women who are just pulled in along with all of this drama. They're stateside, they don't have any direct participation. One of them makes the cover of this book, but maybe you feel sorry for them, but you don't feel sorry for anybody else in this book. Except for me, maybe, in that climax, Queeg's lawyer, a guy named Chalico, who's forced to defend Queeg. He's constantly objecting in the course of the trial. that, what are we talking about this for? This is not about Captain Queeg. He is not on trial. Why is Marrick's lawyer doing any of this? Why aren't we talking about Marrick's mutiny? And then at the end of the trial scene, when Queeg has gone on in a long monologue and pretty much convicted himself out of his own mouth in view of the judges, when he leaves the court, his lawyer gives a peroration that is not in the movie. It's a terrible shame. The Queeg's lawyer in the movie is played by E.G. Marshall, who's terrific. He would have given a great version of that conclusion. Queeg's lawyer is completely right that there are no accusations coming against Captain Queeg from anyone superior to him in the chain of command. These are all coming from disgruntled underlings. They're not corroborated by his record. They're not corroborated by any observations of superior officers. And you don't have to be in the Navy 2 or 3 years before you encounter a commander who is a little bit eccentric. It's absolutely normal. You can sense Challico looking at the judges in command because they must have their own eccentricities. It's utterly winning. There's not a point of that defense that isn't true. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Queeg has condemned himself out of his own mouth, and Marrick is acquitted. Now, we know from the falling action of this book, the climax of the book is that trial. But there's a lot of action that comes after that. We know from that after effect that Marrick is a marked man. He'll never make it in the Navy. He has committed mutiny. I mean, he's been acquitted, technically, because of the fancy dancing of his lawyer for attacking the captain. But no captain is going to take him. It'll be in his record. And so he's ruined. But Kiefer is not. Kiefer is untouched. He was the orchestrator behind all of this. It's unlikely that Marrick would have thought of doing any of what he did if not for Kiefer. All throughout the book, very subtly, Kiefer is right there, pushing people. And Queeg knows it. For all he's oblivious to a lot of other things, he knows it. He knows the incredible hatred that Kiefer has for him, and is constantly saying, both at the trial scene and before that all I'm trying to do is help you. If you want to be a naval officer, I'm just trying to help you. You don't know how much of that is true, but like I said, Wouk is perfect at making you kind of want to like Queeg. You can't like him, but you kind of want to. And there's a great climactic scene where Marrick's defense lawyer lays into Kiefer, says, you're the real mutineer here. You're not touched by any of this. You weren't on trial. It's Marrick who will pay. It's Queeg who will pay. But you're the orchestrator behind all of this. You were the force behind the Caine mutiny. And what you're going to get out of it? A book. The scene takes place at a book launch party, the equivalent at the time of a book launch party, because Kiefer has sold a book for $1,000 to his publisher about his time in the Navy. It's a weird reflection on Wouk's part of the vampire nature of this writer, when Wouk is telling you that in a book that he wrote about the Navy. It's weird, and the prediction turns out to be true. Kiefer does go on to command the Caine. And Wouk leaves us with one slam bang, no pun intended, action sequence at the final bit of the book, to sort of hammer home all the points that he's been making about the true nature of heroism, about the fading nature of loyalty, and also to make you think about Captain Queeg when he's long off the scene. That final action, the final scenes of this book will make you think of Captain Queeg and wonder about him. In other words, in the course of this book, Wouk presents us with one big, tangled mess of an incident. There's no clear-cut answers anywhere in the book. Yes, Kiefer stoked resentment against Queeg on the part of Marrick and everyone else on board. But Queeg still merited resentment. And yes, Marrick is all broken up about taking command from his captain in front of his officers. There are no guns drawn. No one's confined to quarters or anything like that. But there is a mutiny, and Marrick is all broken up about it. But it happens in the middle of a scene where any reader will say if it didn't happen, they'd all die. I loved it. I just loved it. I was reading it and I was worrying about it because it's like I mentioned, it's often unvarnished. There's very rough language. Kiefer's mother, his doting society mother, actually mentions that, well, you picked up a lot of language in the Navy. and he tells her, you don't know from Navy language. We get a lot of that in this book, but it's not just that. It's also that this is a product of its time. This came out in 1951. So you get great ruminations on the war. I want to read you one of those, where the Caine is just attacking an individual island, helping to attack an individual island, because you had to go island hopping in the Pacific campaign. I'll just read you a bit of this here. It was a queer battle, the fight for Kwajalein, to be a young man's initiation into warfare. Possibly it was the queerest that had ever been fought. It had been won thousands of miles away, months before a shot was fired. The admirals had guessed correctly that the Mikado's unsinkable carriers were short of an important commodity, planes. Too many Japanese aircraft had been clawed out of the sky in the broils around the Solomons. As for the warships, the remaining ones had to be precious to the Empire. The frugally guarded weapons are no weapons at all. With the mere arrival of the American array of ships and men, the battle was theoretically over. There was nothing at Kwajalein but a few thousand Japanese soldiers to face the monstrous fleet rising out of the sea. They were blasted into utter impotence in a few hours by an avalanche of bombs and shells. A white flag should have flown from each islet at sunrise by all the logic of war, since the Japs, so we have queer as an adjective and we have Japs as a term, since the Japs appeared illogically unwilling to surrender, the naval bombarders set about annihilating them with an oddly good-humored, ribald ferocity. Willie enjoyed and applauded the spectacle with no thought of its fatality. Under a garish pink and blue sunset, the bombardment was taking on the air of a Mardi Gras. The green islands were blazing in wide red splotches now, pretty crimson dotted lines of tracer bullets laced across the purple waters. The gouts of flame at the big guns' muzzles grew brighter and yellower in the twilight, and concussions regularly shook the atmosphere, while the smell of powder hung everywhere, strangely mingled in the puffs of the breeze with the spicy sweetness of crushed and burning tropic foliage. Willie leaned on the bulwark of the flying bridge, his life jacket dumped at his feet, his helmet pushed back from his head and forehead. So he's looking at it as a spectacle. He doesn't even have his life jacket on anymore. There's no chance of returning fire. So he doesn't need to worry about it. You get long sections like that throughout the book, even at the end, even after the trial is over. Long sections like that are designed to vividly, impressionistically convey the war. And it works. It works a lot. That was another thing I noticed about this book, how atmospheric it is. You get so concentrated on the dialogue, because Wouk is so good at that. Here, not in all of his books, but here, that you tend to forget that you're getting a real sense-around experience of the war, a pattern that would be repeated often in World War II books. So this was my reread for BookTube at War last night. Not what I was expecting. I was thinking that I would read the typhoon scene again, but I did. I found the typhoon scene in this. Every scene is carefully marked in this book. I went to the typhoon scene, started reading, and thought, it's been a while since I started at the beginning of this book. I did, and just kept going. Just kept going. It was kind of amazing. And my hat's off to Herman Wouk. He was 40 when he wrote this book. And he went on living and writing every day for 70 more years. 70 more years of writing. So a whole lifetime of a human being, from birth to death, was the fullness of his career. He was already a working, paid writer who'd had wartime experience and everything else under his belt before he wrote this book. And he just kept going. For 70 more years of writing, he wrote a book in the last year of his life, at age 102, or something like that. And not all of those later books are bad. He was up and down like a lot of writers, but a lot of that work is really, really good. I don't know what we'll do. I don't know what literary posterity will do with Herman Wouk. I think if literary posterity is handed over to censors, as seems to be the pattern in 2023, then this book will never be reprinted because of the language, because that would mean that Herman Wouk was a racist. It would mean anyone who's ever loved this is a racist. It would mean that Humphrey Bogart is a racist. It would mean that you are a racist if you read it, or even touch it, or even look at it. I don't know if that will end up being true. It would largely depend on those censors actually reading this book, which they don't seem inclined to do. I'm hoping that it survives, definitely. And certainly it has been such a publishing success, hardcover and a million paperbacks, that you can certainly find a copy of this. So if you do, whether it's a mass market paperback, there were a million of those, or there were a couple of different trade paperbacks. If you see one of these just gathering dust at a yard sale, and you think of it as a 1950s book, they knew how to write them. They knew how to write them. When they did it well, they did it really well. I felt the same thing about 7 Days in May when we did a read-along of that last year. I felt the same thing about that when I reread it up at the house in Vermont. I thought, wow, you really forget how well put together a lot of these books are. So my BookTube at War book is a strong recommendation. An unexpected one. I wasn't expecting to plow through a reread of the Caine Mutiny last night, but we'll see what tonight brings. Well, maybe the book that I originally picked for last night will make it to the top of the pile unless something else hijacks me. But anyway, that's my book for today. That's my field report. I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.